demonetized.
Yeah, and it would require us to do stuff like, try HelloFresh. Your first 5 meals are 10% off or some shit like that.
Freshly. Or like, no, we advertise razors, mattresses, and what's the other thing that podcasters usually like advertise for?
Audible.
Audible books.
Dollar Shave Club, Castaway Mattress, like you were just saying. And
Harry's.
Harry's also, yeah.
I do use Harry's. The Truman.
I do too.
The Truman razor is amazing.
The Gentleman Truman's razor of choice.
What we're trying to say is we are an extremely, extremely poor group of recent graduates who are trying to do something. Please send us money.
During coronavirus relief, we are going to do anything for money. And that, for you as a listener, is up for you to decide which thing we'll be doing.
Winky face, baby.
Horny on Main.
Oh yeah, man. Man, if this doesn't work out, I'm gonna be like at Wendy's, licking the burgers.
Just be like, yo, you want extra ketchup with that?
Do you want to dip your fries in my Frosty?
Oh God.
Are we still talking about fast food beverages?
Is a milkshake a beverage?
A milkshake is a weird, like, either it's it can be a dessert or it can be a drink.
I mean, it's in a cup with a straw, so I guess my hot take for the episode is that yes, it's definitely a beverage.
And if we're talking best milkshakes, In-N-Out Neapolitan. All right, I'm done. No comments, questions, or criticisms.
Don't at me.
Don't at me on Twitter.
What if I have concerns?
Well, what concern
Fuck your
can you
concerns.
have? Do you hate strawberries?
Oh, I love strawberries. Damn.
See, that is flawed. Blocked at the front door. Boom.
All right, boys, let's get back to it.
Let's.
All right, guys, welcome back to A Mouthful of History. This is the sultry voice of your host, Nicholas Malott. Joined with me, as always, Cameron Millage.
Hello.
And David Hollingsworth.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well.
All right. When last we got together, we were talking about, basically, we gave you the Batman Begins of French Indochina War. Today, we give you the Dark Knight of the French Indochina War.
Let's go.
Let's do this thing.
Take it away.
Okay, so in our last episode, we talked about why the French were in Vietnam. We talked about the rise of Ho Chi Minh and the creation of the Communist Party. And we talked about World War II and how the Vietnamese defeated the Japanese with the help of the United States, somewhat. We were talking about, as well, the negotiations between the French and the Vietnamese at Fontainebleau over sovereignty of Vietnam to the Vietnamese. That went to a stalemate. And then we led to the Haiphong incident well after the French came back to Indochina, which a French cruiser bombed or started shelling the city of Haiphong, killing 6,000 Vietnamese citizens, which led to the Battle of Hanoi, which led to the beginning of the French Indochina War. Now we're going to talk about the climactic battle between both of these sides, Dien Bien Phu. So the French were getting beat back by the Vietnamese because the Vietnamese knew the land. If the tactics aren't broken, don't fix it.
Yeah, it's actually very, even if you're at like a technical disadvantage or a man disadvantage, well, you're never really at a man disadvantage when you're playing defense. Generally speaking, when you're fighting on your home turf, it's easier to win battle because you don't have to do anything except for not concede.
Yeah, you're just playing not to lose. You're not necessarily playing to win.
Yeah, you're not fighting for anything. Thing that the Americans are learning they would learn in Vietnam, and they should have learned from Vietnam when they got into Afghanistan and Iraq. They're not playing for anything except for just wait till you guys get tired.
Yeah, and it would be stupid for any imperialist power to think that the people they're colonizing would play to their rules, as the French thought that they were able to do. Throughout the French Indochina War, the Viet Minh were pushing back the French, and the Viet Minh were able to take most of the North Vietnamese countryside, controlled all the countryside, and controlled most of North Vietnam. French still had Laos, and they still had some ports left in Hanoi and stuff like that. So General Henri Navarre is French, he hatched a plan to try to get the Vietnamese to fight a decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu. It's a city in Vietnam, of course, and he wanted to use Dien Bien Phu as an airstrip to help reestablish supply lines, cut off the North Vietnamese as well.
I can't imagine a situation worse than trying to pit everything into a decisive battle, because What are you going to do? Like, one mess up or just even slightly underestimating your opponent and you're lost and you've lost everything.
Yeah, if you make something all or nothing, then if you get the nothing, you're in trouble.
It's just the French had the superior technology, superior artillery. Navarre thought that he can get the Viet Minh out onto an open playing field and his superior weaponry would take the day.
Most of Vietnam is jungle, though.
Yeah, it's literally like if you want to try to play in your own game as the away team, you're not going to in Vietnam. Again, it's that hubris, that, what we consider first world country hubris, thinking that we're amazing, we're the best, we can take out anybody we want. And that's not true.
That's the arrogance of just finishing up a world war, where most of it is, what is it? It's countryside and city fighting, because all of Europe is countryside or city fighting.
Yeah.
So you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
Except for, of course, the Battle of the Bulge, which was done in a huge forest.
Oh, yeah. That was Hitler's last push. And so the thing with Dien Bien Phu is it also had an airstrip, which could help with supply drops. But the airstrip was badly destroyed. It wasn't in a fully functional airstrip. It probably was bombed out. It just wasn't workable.
So did anybody tell him maybe this wouldn't work?
And there were some generals who disagree with him, but most notably a guy named René Cognier. And my research didn't go into why, but just there were generals who disagree with it because it's just they knew the Vietnamese weren't going to play on the terms of the French. Navarre overruled them. And context, Henri Navarre is the supreme commander of all French troops in Indochina. So he'd be akin to Eisenhower.
So
in World War II.
He had
He had the final say and everything.
And
so
he came up with the plan. So
he gave everyone the middle finger and said, "We are going to do it, and we are going to win." and so Operation Castor is initially commenced. So that's what the French called Dien Bien Phu, Operation Castor. It's like castor oil. I really don't even know at this point. So the battle begins November 23rd, 1953. There is initial drop of French troops and engineers, and the French quickly retook the airstrip and the engineers rebuilt it. But the thing is, they didn't really get any commanders until later, like a week later. So
Wait. So let me get this straight. He sets up this big plan to get Vietnamese to fight a pitched battle with them to decide the fate of Indochina, and he didn't think about who he wanted commanding everything at this point?
I mean, I guess there probably was a miscommunication in airdrops and stuff like that. I don't know why you'd send troops and engineers before commanders. I don't know why. But I think we also should give the layout for Dien Bien Phu to our listeners. That there's an airstrip and it's surrounded by hills. So this is kind of like a pushed-in area, hills on all sides, besides going out towards the sea. I don't know. I'm not good with compasses. But it's surrounded by hills. We're going to go back to this. And so for the next 3 months, the French decided to do reconnaissance missions into the forest and the hills. 1, zero benefit. 2, they were losing men. And it just did nothing, and it just built up casualties in the process.
Yeah, I'm certain that another major Western power will understand that and then not let that happen to them later.
No,
in
of
the
course.
same
Yeah,
country.
I know, right?
God, could you imagine?
If the Nazis didn't learn from Napoleon in the 1800s, what do we think we can learn lessons in this? Who knows?
No,
we'll find out later.
Actually, I have no idea how these powers survived making the same mistakes over and over and over again.
It's almost like when you study history, you learn from the past or something.
They still study Napoleon military techniques, but apparently military training stops when you end up in, oh, this is what you shouldn't do in Russia. And apparently the U.S., who did back the French during these fights, didn't take notes.
Oh, yeah. They absolutely didn't. And so when the airstrip was fixed and all the troops that were necessary were there. So the French set up some strong points. And so these strong points are named Eliane, Huguette, Gabrielle, Beatrice, Anne-Marie, Françoise, Dominique, Isabelle, and Claudine. Fun fact of all of these strong point names, they were all the names of Christian de Castries' mistresses.
That is such a French thing to do.
It's like if one strong point went down, it's like, I didn't like her anyway.
I was never that into Beatrix anywho.
I was never into Beatrice anyway.
That's 9 mistresses. That is way too much to, on top of his wife, that means 10. He has to balance 10 women.
Yeah, having 10 people on the side, that sounds exhausting. I could never do that.
I guess in a relationship, you shouldn't talk about your ex-girlfriends, I think, according to Armchair Historian, the same applies to war. And so they were able to set up these strong points, and they thought they'd be able just to shell the Viet Minh into the hills. But there's another man on the Viet Minh side that will change the balance of this battle for good. And his name is General Vo Nguyen Giap, or AKA the Red Napoleon. He will also be responsible for kicking the Americans out of Vietnam.
Quite a
And
nickname, and it sounds like he lived up to it.
yeah, and as I'll tell you, being the Red Napoleon is not out of left field.
You don't give somebody a comparison to one of the greatest military minds of all time lightly. You have to earn it, and apparently this guy earned it.
He earned it in spades. So he does the unthinkable, and that changes the battle in the Viet Minh's favor. So he had all of his soldiers dismantle every single bit of artillery and trek it over 500 miles and to set it up in the hills. And they would even create tunnels to where only you can see the barrel come out of the hills.
Damn.
And so what that basically meant is that he surrounded all the hills, and every side had artillery, and the French couldn't do anything about it. So whatever superior the French had, they lost it.
Having a hard time believing that like the rest of Europe and the United States watched the French get systematically dismantled because they thought they were fighting another European power when they clearly weren't, and did nothing about it except for maybe just laugh about it.
Yeah, and they thought that, all right, we got better soldiers, better weapons, better artillery. We can take them out easily. And it's like, you see this, and it's just like, all right, the battle's already lost. All right, boys, GG. GG. Like,
This is just like when Russia thought they could bully Japan around, and then Japan came in and kicked their ass.
During the early 1900s?
Yeah.
Yep. Or even when the Soviet Union was like, we can invade Afghanistan, it'll be fine. And then Afghanistan was their Vietnam.
okay, so I probably should go into the numbers. So there was about 12,000 French soldiers, 13,000 to some estimates, and there was also 64,000 Viet Minh troops. The Viet Minh had a 3-1 advantage, and that's just natural because they're the home team. So here's the thing. Both sides benefited from powerful allies, and the Viet Minh got help from Communist China in the form of artillery and military advisors, and the French got support from the United States in the form of supplies and paid up to 80% at one point of the war effort for France.
Wow, it's we're just throwing money away at that point.
Seriously.
And one of the big players in U.S. foreign policy at the time is J. Foster Dulles, John Dulles.
Ugh.
And so this is the idea of the containment theory. So David, what is the containment theory for our listeners?
All right. So basically, containment theory was the idea that guided most Cold War presidential administrations to some extent or another, up until Reagan, who just made it worse and just less humane. But anyway,
Fuck Reagan.
yeah, fuck Reagan. Containment theory was the idea that you needed to contain communism wherever it sprouted up, or else it would just keep expanding. And so, say, China goes communist the way it did, you need to contain communist China and not let it spread its influence. A really unfortunate underpinning of this idea was the idea that communism anywhere was secretly a ploy of Moscow, which is kind of silly on its face because the United States is like a capitalist country, right? Let's say South Africa, another capitalist country. Does that mean South Africa is just like controlled by the United States and has nothing else that it does? Or Japan or something, right? Another capitalist country right now. Also during the 80s, it was a country we had rivalry with. All of this is to say, just because countries share an economic system doesn't mean that like the more powerful one is controlling everything. The tragedy of all this is that the United States, and especially with the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles, who was, Cameron just said, the Secretary of State, also Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, their way of looking at it was if a independence or freedom movement had strong Marxist elements to it, then it had to be a secret Soviet ploy, and that's why it had to be contained.
Yeah, and I think the closure of markets as well plays into this account too. If like a country's communist or socialist, they're going to want to nationalize their industries. And so we saw this as a war of expanding markets as well, and the French as cash areas. We didn't want the spread of communism anywhere because we want the opportunity to access those markets in those areas, I think.
For those of you listening at home, in history, we like looking for patterns at times. If you're looking for patterns here, all you have to do is stop listening at plot of Moscow and think about how that's applied today.
Yep. And like going off of that, you know, a lot of people today think that radical Islam is just a thing that's like united. But like, for example, Al Qaeda and ISIS are enemies. And so it goes into like the greater idea here, which is to say that if two countries or movements or entities of any kind share some sort of common ideology, whether it's an economic ideology, a religious one, a certain political one, whatever, that doesn't mean that they are completely interconnected. And, you know, during this time, Vietnam is getting supplies and support from the Soviet Union and China, but as a sort of way of using whatever resources they can leverage, which again, they had already tried to turn to the United States and the United States brushed them away. Well, just because the US brushes you away doesn't mean you don't want independence and liberation. And so they were left with the Soviet Union and China. But there were already tensions specifically between the Vietnamese and Soviet Union on one side and China on the other. But that could be an episode for another day.
So to sum it all up, we supported the French because we didn't want communism spreading into Southeast Asia. So that gave us an impetus to support the French.
Still seems like the sanest course of action would have been do nothing, let Vietnam win, and then say we support a new burgeoning self-determining government in Southeast Asia.
Exactly, which the Vietnamese were very clearly on record of having wanted that and would have embraced that with open arms.
Yeah. Let's get back to the battle, shall we?
Sounds good.
All right. So, I mean, all of the points we said are 100% contextual and apply to this battle and the overarching war. Let's get to the shelling of Beatrice. So this is the first stronghold to go down. So it took place on March 13th, 1954. Viet Minh started to bombard strongpoint Beatrice. They got lucky. A shell hit the command bunker and all the officers died. And so it's like...
that never happens.
Yeah, it hit, just boom, just knocks out the bunker, killing key officers. What Jap did with the Viet Minh was to kind of do all these full frontal meat shield assaults. So just throw all of these soldiers at the strong point. So it's kind of just like, it's overwhelmed with numbers. They were able to take strong point Beatrice, but they had lost a lot of casualties. You know, I mean, still, the Viet Minh had more soldiers. So Jap believed, like, all right, I have like the upper hand. I have more men. Let's just overwhelm them with force. The Viet Minh next went for Gabrielle. And so Gabrielle was the furthest north. It was one of the stronger points on the perimeter. So De Castries felt that they were going to go after Gabrielle next. He was correct. So De Castries didn't want to retake Beatrice initially. It's over. Like,
He just wanted to leave it, cut his losses.
and so to reinforce Gabrielle, which he did, because he knew that the Viet Minh were probably going to go after Gabrielle next, which he was correct. But the Viet Minh took it over.
Sometimes it's unfortunate, but sometimes even though you know something's coming, and you see this in sports all the time, like, you know, like, oh, like 9 out of 10 times they run this play in this situation. Most of the time, there's nothing you can do about it.
Well, because look, like the Viet Minh had artillery on all hills. So how can you really repel against that if you're the French? Really, it's almost like a suicide mission. That's a death sentence. Like, they're surrounded, and now they're just fighting for their lives. So after Gabrielle gets taken, the artillery officer there, Charles Perrault, falls on his own sword. He commits suicide. He had this quote, and he said, "I am completely dishonored. I have guaranteed De Castries that the enemy artillery couldn't touch us, but now we're going to lose the battle. I am leaving."
Oof.
That's kind of the symbolism of the French hubris. You know what I mean? Like, they thought because of their superior artillery, superior manpower, we're going to defeat the Viet Minh. But then, psych! They somehow didn't know that all these hills could be used to help the Viet Minh.
Mm-hmm. Well, you get what you pay for, unfortunately.
Yeah. So the soldiers retreat to Huguette and Anne-Marie. So all of De Castries' mistresses are going down one by one. And
I'm sure he's used to it.
he's like, I didn't care about all of them.
Someone just hand me a red beret and a skinny cigarette.
And have the Moulin Rouge on side. So the French refused to retreat from the 5 main strongholds due to the fact that they were still receiving supplies and reinforcement via airdrops. So as I talked about earlier, the United States was funding 80% of the war effort, and at a point they were doing 100% of the airdrops. So you see in those photos, a lot of French soldiers are wearing American equipment. So they had American helmets. Like, you can tell that they were being geared up, like kitted up by the United States.
We're not talking about middle 14th century French army, greatest military in the world at the time. We're talking about post World War II, had to have their asses saved.
Already owned during World War II and barely rebuilt.
Yeah, that's the French military that's going up.
Yeah, they were getting supplies and reinforcements were coming in, so the French felt fairly confident that these 5 inner strong points could be saved. So Beatrice, Eliane, and Isabel were all the outside ones. So Jap decides to attack, but keeps attacking Huguet, and he eventually takes it over April 10th. But then remember those full frontal assaults that he kept trying to do at Beatrice?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So he realized, he's like, all right, I'm losing a lot of men. Like, I gotta mix it up. So he starts to dig trenches around the stronghold of Dien Bien Phu. I don't know how many men he had to go through to realize that that was probably the best course of action.
Oh, yeah. Nothing great has ever come in world history when trenches start getting built.
Nope.
So on April 14th, the Viet Minh took the airstrip. And so the French were still getting supplies, though 55 planes were shot down by Viet Minh aircraft weapons. And so most American planes, they were disguised as civilian planes, and they're just dropping supplies. And so the situation for the French, hindsight, it was inevitable that they were going to lose, but the situation then, they were in dire need. So there was a plan in place to help save the French, more of like a let's annihilate the whole countryside idea, called Operation Vulture. So this was created by the Eisenhower administration. And so this was the plan to save the French. Here's what entailed. The proposed mission would rescue the French in battle. 98 B-29s would drop 14,000 tons of bombs in Vietnam. And our not friend, John Dulles, believed that nukes should be dropped.
Wait. Wasn't the potential of nukes being used what got MacArthur fired during the Korean War?
Yeah.
Which was only at this point 2 years removed from.
Yeah, I don't know what the rhyme or reason was. Like, this was good this time, but not dropping it on Beijing. But I mean, I guess like you don't want to drop the bomb on Beijing because it's China's superpower.
Hey, you don't drop massive bombs like that on major centers. You drop that shit on smaller centers.
I mean, no one should be using nukes.
I mean, I agree, but that's not the point.
I mean, of course. The thing is, that also would have wiped out the French as well.
Yeah.
Like,
I feel bad every time I play Civ and I'm at the end of the game and I have nukes and somebody won't give me their city. I just choose one.
You're a monster, Nick. But we already knew that.
So the thing is, the plan didn't go into place because the United States wanted approval from other allies like England, possibly the rest of NATO.
You mean the people who are probably looking at this at this point, like, yeah, the French lost. Why are we even worrying about it at this point?
Yeah, and the French were still holding out. When the Viet Minh finally stormed Eliane, they were still getting supplies, but the thing is, the Viet Minh had another weapon up their sleeve, and that was Soviet Katyusha rockets. So these, we all know what the Katyusha rockets are. For those who are World War II fanatics, you know, the rockets that get shot off the trucks.
Those ones.
And so they were shooting down plane after plane, destroying all these airdrops. And so it turned into like fight to the death. And they were about to surrender, but from high command, they kept saying, it's too late now, don't surrender. Try to regain your honor through death. That was sort of like the whole idea. So the hill was lost after 10 hours of combat. And the French officially surrendered on May 7th, 1954.
So they were right. It was a decisive battle. It's just not the way they had it planned.
What really, from what began as like, all right, we need to reestablish supply lines, turned into an inevitable loss.
I think you hit the nail on the head, though. It basically was an arrogance ploy. They didn't take the Vietnam seriously as an opponent. They thought that once they set everything up their way, they would walk all over them, and that as soon as they just like, oh, we're not going to worry about it because we'll set up the supply line, we'll get all our supplies, we'll get our men, and we'll knock them out. They didn't anticipate, nor did they think the Vietnamese would be smart enough strategic enough to set up in time to counter this, and they miscalculated and they paid the price for it. They lost.
Good old imperial hubris, am I right, folks?
They should have seen it coming, but they didn't because they couldn't. Because, again, it's long been established that Western powers don't take the rest of the world seriously. This is why you have things like the French losing to Vietnam. You have the Russians losing to Japan. You have the Americans losing to Vietnam. You have the Russians, which I know is it's not really a Western power, but it's still a European power, getting their ass kicked by Afghanistan.
And I think this battle is a testament to how resourceful Jap was.
Yeah.
Like, he made the pivotal decision to disassemble all of his artillery and bring it up into the hills and to nullify the French artillery. I found a quote from him. He said this after Vietnam. This quote was in the context of why America lost, but I think it's perfectly acceptable now. It's like, look, David didn't win by fighting Goliath in a sword fight. Like, David knew he would have died instantly if he fought Goliath at his own game.
It's true, I did know that.
Oh yeah, and you're still alive. Fuck.
The moral of the David and Goliath story isn't just that, anybody can come up and beat, even if you're the underdog, you can beat the big guy. It's that the brute force isn't always the best course of action, and you have to think strategically when you're going up against somebody who is stronger than you.
Yeah, and this is the same Jap that I think wrote a biography that said why I won Vietnam, why I kicked the U.S. out of Vietnam or something like that. But it just showed that when you're the away team, you're not going to get the home team to play how you want you to play. Like, yeah, David didn't kill Goliath with a sword. He killed him with a sling.
You don't show up as the visiting team unless you're playing the Chargers. You don't show up as the visiting team.
Roasted.
I like those self-owns.
You don't show up as the visiting team and expect the crowd to give you, like, oh, we're going to be respectful while they play. No, of course not. You yell and you scream and you holler and you make them uncomfortable. And in war, it's the same thing. They come into your territory, you make things uncomfortable, you play on your battles. Oh, hey, Vietnam is a lot of jungle makes up a lot of Vietnam, and a lot of hills make up Vietnam. Let's use that to our advantage. They're not expecting that.
Yep.
Yeah, this was the cataclysmic defeat the French suffered, and this would ultimately bring Vietnam at a greater leverage of negotiation for the Geneva Conference. So all the world's powers met in Geneva, Switzerland, hence the Geneva Conference, to discuss the future of not only Asia, but that of Indochina, aka the Vietnamese and the French. So discussions about the French and the Vietnamese started as the French got wrecked in Dien Bien Phu.
And
I love that. Like, they got their shit like wrecked. And
Capital W wrecked.
this is like the peak like imperialism right here. You got your ass kicked, and now we have to have a big conference to make you feel better about the fact that you got your ass kicked.
Yeah, you got washed, son.
That all the world's powers know you got wrecked.
Right? You were basically like any of John Jones's MMA opponents other than like Alexander Gustafsson in their first fight.
And cocaine.
Yeah, his biggest opponent of all, or
Actually,
just like not making bad decisions.
Yeah, basically.
So, interestingly enough, arguably the most like interested party in the Geneva Conference, other than Vietnam itself, was basically the United States. And so we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but the people that were really kind of spearheading the U.S.'s position were the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the CIA Director, Allen Dulles, who were brothers. And they were just the staunchest of Cold War warriors. And from what all records indicate, like very ideologically committed. And so they had actually just come off of overthrowing democratically elected leaders in Iran in 1953 and in Guatemala in 1954. And those actually weren't even communist leaders. Those were just kind of like lefty liberation sort of social democrats, which basically means you still have capitalism, but you have a very strong social safety net, pro-labor conditions and things like that.
And the nationalization of industries as well.
Yeah, that's really where the socialism kicks in there. But Mossadegh in Iran?
Yep, Mossadegh.
His big sin was Iranian oil for Iranians.
Yeah, so it's such a terrible idea, right? And then in Guatemala, the thing that really pushed the Dulles brothers over the edge was when they appropriated unused land on large Guatemalan estates, which Funny story, or just side note about that. The way they went about doing it is when they appropriated that land, they didn't not give compensation, but they gave compensation based on the claimed value that these large, agricultural businesses had claimed the land was worth. And these corporations like drastically undervalued their land. And so when Guatemala's president, Jacobo Arbenz, the one that would be overthrown in 1954, when he passed this law saying that the multinational corporations would be compensated based on the value they put on their taxes, they were super pissed off, but they couldn't actually say anything because then they'd be admitting that they purposefully drastically undervalued the worth of their their land.
They reap what they sowed, essentially.
Yeah, and then
in this case, literally.
Then the U.S. government and deep state basically bailed them out.
Basically, yeah. And so the U.S. was coming off of having successfully overthrown these democratically elected leaders. And so they believed at this point that the U.S. was really starting to come up as a power during the Cold War that could get the results that they wanted. And so the U.S. thought it could be the same with Vietnam. And I had talked about this a little bit in the previous episode as well, but the biggest tragedy of all this is that they really had this mindset that all communists everywhere in the entire world were controlled by the Soviet Union. And therefore, any sort of movement or any administration for a government that had any association with communism whatsoever was a Soviet ploy. Again, both Mossadegh in Iran and Arbenz in Guatemala were more social democrats as opposed to actual communists or even socialists, really.
Like we would get in Latin America as we got into the 60s.
Exactly, yeah. These people were more FDR than they were Fidel Castro. And so the way the U.S. saw this was all of these liberation movements that had any association whatsoever with communism in their home countries, because both in Iran and Guatemala, because there was political freedom, even though none of the elected people were communists. There were some communists who were loosely affiliated with some of the people that were in cabinet positions. But again, these were communists who were in no way connected to the Soviet Union, who were just kind of local idealists that were around.
Yeah.
At this point, the United States just fully thought now, if we're going to overthrow social democrats that are tenuously connected to local communists, then of course we're going to see Vietnam as the enemy. We're going to see Ho Chi Minh as a puppet of the Soviets and China, which is kind of extra funny given the fact that there were already tensions developing between the Soviet Union and China.
Yeah, we were getting close to the Sino-Russian split.
Yep.
Yeah. In July 1954, ultimately an agreement was signed. So the French pulled out of North Vietnam, and the country would be split at the 17th parallel pending elections 2 years after this agreement was signed. The elections would determine whether Vietnam would be united or divided. The Communist North and the Democratic South set up by the French.
And it must be said, democratic is in air quotes because...
Yes, I put those air quotes in there. I even do air quotes myself.
Much like the early portions of the democratic South Korea, which is essentially ran as a dictatorship.
And Ho Chi Minh felt unsatisfied at this outcome because his ultimate goal was a completely united Vietnam free of any imperialistic rule. And so while Ho Chi Minh, they got the French out of North Vietnam, he still saw this as what the I can't even get full victory now? But I would feel for Ho.
Yeah, I mean, this is after 40 years of always extending olive branches to the United States. This is kind of where Ho Chi Minh is dude, I've been trying to be really friendly and cordial, and you're still fighting me.
Yeah. The tragedy of this is after the war with the United States, Ho Chi Minh wouldn't even really live to see the united Vietnam.
Yep.
Yeah, and the United States also does not sign the agreement as well. They don't sign it. And they saw this agreement as a disaster.
Yep.
They believe that if this election would happen, the Vietnamese people would overwhelmingly vote for a united communist Vietnam.
Maybe they should be asking themselves why the hell the Vietnamese were more inclined to support Ho Chi Minh and not the South, but that's two thoughts, which is one more thought than they're comfortable with.
They couldn't put two and two together. It's like, oh my God, they're going to be communists. I wonder why. The people would have better opportunities under communism and would see that might have a better life under communism.
Yeah, and especially with that like platform that we were talking about earlier, right? There's many different forms of communism, but when the platform that the Viet Minh were laying out were things like, universal education, labor rights, better infrastructure, things like that, then it's like, who the hell is going to say no to that?
Yeah, the U.S. made South Vietnam anti-communist and gave the government money and military assistance. And so we have to highlight who was ruling South Vietnam right before the Vietnam War. Ngo Dinh Diem. He fought for the French. He was a high commander in their army during the French Indochina War. I don't know whether he was involved in Dien Bien Phu. I don't know. Actually, I do know. He wasn't even there. Wasn't he? I don't know why I said that. Describe the whole thought. And so he was fighting for the French. He's a commander in the French army in Indochina. So this was the guy that the U.S. was giving money to.
And also the ones who the U.S. would assassinate just before the outbreak of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, because he got so monstrous that he was getting in the way of the U.S. efficiently running South Vietnam. But then the problem therein was because the U.S. had propped up this just corrupt, not popularly supported dictatorship. When they overthrew the dictator, South Vietnam spiraled. And that's why, this is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but, when we pulled out of Vietnam, South Vietnam fell soon thereafter. And it's not because they were like crazy outgunned by superior technology or something. It's because the South didn't have any real popular support. The U.S. was propping up South Vietnam as a state in a way that just could not be sustainable based on popular will alone.
So we can determine that the elections never happened.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because the U.S. knew. They knew that if they actually went to the elections, the people would vote for a united North and they would have another communist country to deal with, even though I don't think anybody, even in their wildest dreams, believed that Vietnam would get involved on the world stage.
No, and actually, just a fun... Okay, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I think it's really interesting to the point that we're talking about. So we've heard of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, right? The genocidal communist regime.
Yeah.
Vietnam actually went to war with them. Vietnam on behalf of the Soviet Union, kind of. Cambodia kind of on the behalf of China. And so Vietnam actually fought communist Cambodia because, again, geopolitics is a very complex web, and just because you have something in common with another country, whether it's economic or political or religious or whatever, doesn't mean that you're these interconnected puppets.
Yeah, they all have their different goals.
Yeah, and despite our admittedly left lean here at A Mouthful of History, it doesn't matter that Cambodia was a communist country. Pol Pot was an incredible piece of shit.
A monster.
And fun fact, there's a cemetery right next to where I live called Loma Vista in Fullerton, and that's where the exiled president of Cambodia is buried.
Oh, shit.
So there is a bit of history there. To tie it all up, after these elections that didn't happen, the U.S. gets fully committed into Vietnam. But I think we also have to realize that how fast the French Empire fell after this. Because not long after, 1962, they lost Algeria.
Yeah. I mean, the Second French Empire really lasted from 1830 and their initial invasion of Algeria to after World War II. It collapses in Vietnam, it collapses in Algeria, it collapses in a lot of most places.
And they can say all they want, oh no, we were the Third Republic and the Fourth Republic, but no, they were still maintaining their empire.
Yeah, and there is a brilliant movie that you two have not watched called The Battle of Algiers. It was also directed in 1966. So it was only 4 years after the conflict, and they had actors who were in Dien Bien Phu and Algerian independence fighters in there as well.
That is pretty crazy.
So this is a top 10 movie of all time. It's by an Italian director, forgot his name, but it's French language. And it's really one of the best movies I've seen in terms of independent. Like, it's all time, but also for independence movements in general.
Definitely a future mouthful historical movies episode.
Oh,
I
yeah.
was just thinking that.
That is definitely a mouthful of history to handle.
So basically the stage is set for America versus Vietnam in what is, up until recently, the biggest war blunder the U.S. ever made.
Yep. Because we're number one, we're also number one in war blunders. And so now we've been in the Middle East for as long as some like legally able to vote adults have been
There
alive.
are people who were born in 2001 who are now going to war. They've known nothing but war.
Jeez.
Anyways, ending on that happy thought, thank you for listening, everyone. We really appreciate your support. I mean, I can only speak for myself here, but for me, I really love using this podcast as a platform to like teach people things, but also have fun, but also provoke critical thought about history. And so it's just really nice to know that people are listening. And I really just appreciate you all out there.
Thank you for all the interactions on our social media pages. Thank you for all the suggestions that you tell us. And it shows that all of you care, and that gives us way more motivation to continue.
Yeah. Thank you. And join us next time where we stick with our communist theme and we talk about Russia.
Oh man, that's going to be so uncontroversial.
Have a good day, everybody.
Hardly. Have a good day.